have to say we have a record number of folks joining us tonight, which is fantastic. Again, I'm Pam Howard, the Executive Director at Historic Albany Foundation. So I just wanted to do a couple housekeeping and thank yous before we get started. Obviously, we want to thank the New York State Writers Institute for their partnership, as well as the Book House for giving a discount on the books for our book club. And also Dave Hochfelder, who moderated our first and second session this time, which was really wonderful. We had a lot of questions, so I hope you saved some questions for tonight for Mr. Kennedy and for Paul Grondel. And so with that, I am more than happy to introduce Pulitzer Prize winning author William Kennedy, who's going to join us tonight and speak about answer our questions about Roscoe, which we just figured out is celebrating its 20th anniversary of publication. And also thank you to Paul Grondel from New York State Writers Institute, who has helped set tonight up and is going to be helping moderate some questions as well. So thank you, thank you. And I'll turn it over to Paul to kick us off and get us started.
Thanks so much, Pam. It's really great to be here at Bill Kennedy's house. He's my mentor. He's the founder of the New York State Writers Institute. He's a friend to writers near and far. And it's really great that this group has been fully engaged with Roscoe, this tremendous novel that came out, like you said, 20 years ago. It's really nice to see some familiar faces. I know you have questions, so I'll just throw out the first one. I know this was your big political novel, Bill, that you thought about for a long time before you got to it. Why did you write other novels first? Why did you delay writing this, your big political novel, the Dan and Erastus novel that you used to call it?
Yeah, because I didn't know enough about the machine. I came to a point at one point where I was somewhere in the 60s. I was writing about the machine every day in my job as a reporter in the Times Union. And it was obviously something that was a great subject for a novel, for me anyway. Only the more I learned about it, the more I realized how much more there was to learn. And so I was always sort of, as a newspaper man, sort of an adversarial figure to the machine.
Exactly.
At one time I was public enemy #1, I think. But that changed, and I mean, I didn't change, but I stopped being a newspaper man after a while in 1970, and I went full-time. I'd been full-time as a novelist, but I was still a part-time journalist, and I became I started to pursue everybody I could, machine. And I interviewed Charlie Ryan, and the mayor had asked me actually to write his biography at one point, and I kept interviewing him, even though I was public enemy. I really wasn't,
Right.
They realized I was a newspaper man.
Right.
So, and then John Holt Harris, Charlie Ryan, so many people that were running Jolion, people who were running the machine, Jack McEnany, anybody who had anything to do with it, Dick Connors, my father. I interviewed my family endlessly about anything that they had to do with it, and a lot of them did have something to do with it. But anyway, it began to accumulate, and it was still too much to do. And I started with Billy Phelan. That was where I really kind of created the Phelan family. It wasn't really. I mean, I created them back in Puerto Rico, but I never published that book. It was called One by One, and it was also called The Angels and the Sparrows. It was about the Phelan family, but I could never get it together. And when I started seriously try to write a book. I began with the ink truck, and I was working on it was a kind of an absurd novel, and I wanted to do the newspaper strike that we were just involved in at the Times Union. And after I wrote that, I I started to write something about the political machine. And I focused on my uncle as a way to get me into it, because he was a pool hustler and a gambler and card dealer. And he was a great buddy of mine, He was one of the best relatives I ever had. And he was so funny. And anyway, I wrote Billy Phelan, and in that I came across the kidnapping of Dan O'Connell's nephew.
Right.
And that got me into the political machine in a heavy way. I just researched it and saw how they were working and how much power they had, and how they controlled the courts and the police and everything else. And that was the beginning. And then I'd written Legs, and I knew something about the machine and their relationship to the gangsters of the day. Well, they had kept everybody out because they were doing the same thing the gangsters were doing, and they didn't want any competition. Running the bureau,
different kind of game.
And so it was the accumulation of stuff. But the more I went, the bigger the machine got.
Right.
It was a fantastic thing. It's this machine that controlled the whole city and everything. It controlled the courts, the whole police department. Just think about every court, including getting people into the highest court in the state. And it was a phenomenon.
Yeah.
And so I just kept going and going. And I mean, Ironweed grew out of Billy Phelan, and Francis Phelan told me I had to write his story. So I wrote it, and then I just I went on and following my nose, and Very Old Bones, and then Corsage, and ultimately I got around to Roscoe.
Right.
And by that time I had interviewed Erastus at great length, and I'd spent a whole day, afternoon with Dan O'Connell, and he told me great stories and great stuff. And John Holt Harris, and he gave me 5 hours of his time, and we cut up the whole machine from stem to stern. And then after a while, it settled in on me that I had enough.
Yeah.
So I started to write it.
But I want to talk about Roscoe, just a amazing character. So you understand it as journalism and all oral history, and you've seen it and lived it growing up in Albany, but that doesn't make a novel. You've got to create a character who you can get inside his psyche, who is multi-layered, who is flawed, who's interesting to carry through the novel. So he's a composite. I don't see one particular historical character that lines up with Roscoe the way with, say, Patsy McCall or Elisha Fitzgibbons or someone. Who is Roscoe?
Well, Roscoe is nobody in particular. He's an amalgam of a bunch of people. He's part Patsy, but he's also part Jack Murphy, the guy who ran the party for the band.
Right.
Business of the party, and the state bank building. They had the Democratic headquarters there. And it was, there were, Ed O'Connell was Dan's brother, and he was a lawyer, and he was sort of the brains of the machine. And that's what I wanted. I had to have a brain in there. I mean, Dan had a brain, but Dan quit school at the fifth grade,
right,
or something like that. And I didn't want that kind of a primitive education as my narrator. It had to be a sophisticated mind who's putting this story together and whose story we were telling, and it became a composite of several characters. I mean, it was probably 10 people that contributed there, but Edwin Corning, who was very important as Erastus's father, and he was one of the key figures. It was Erastus and Dan and Sally, who Johnny O'Connell called Sally.
Right.
And Patrick was Packy.
Right, Packy McCabe. Yeah.
No. Packy O'Connell. Packy McConnell.
McCall.
McCall, right.
Yeah.
O'Connell. Anyway, that was, all of those people sort of contributed something. And out came Roscoe. And when I started to hear him talk, I found a voice for him. And then I had to know.
Right.
I had a way of telling it. It always comes down to somebody's language.
Right.
And in this case, it was Roscoe's language that really made the thing happen.
One of my favorite sections is how do you get the money? And it starts with money. I mean, you have the machine dealing in 20s, and Roscoe has a drawer full of 20s, and people bring him money. Did you ever see, I've heard stories where people saw, well, the $5 bills in large stacks before Election Day, but did you ever see the money down at Democratic Party headquarters?
No, I was in there once, I think. I think it was on a night that Erastus was running against a candidate who may have beaten
Toohey?
Carl Toohey.
Yeah.
And it was a dismal night, and I was covering, I'd been covering the events of the day at that time, politically. And what year was that? 68? 68?
72, I think.
72?
I think.
Well,
Yeah.
I must have been out. I left in 70. So, but it was Dan Button. It was
Dan Button.
Dan Button was running against him. I was
Right.
in headquarters. But I didn't know, and I never saw the drawer. No, I just know. I know that's the way they did it. But,
Right.
Somebody told me that it was a temporary place where they put the money, whatever they want.
Right.
But I never heard anybody say, "How do you get the money?" But I did hear that somebody asked that question to Dan O'Connell. A fellow named, well, whoever it was, I won't name him, but he was from Troy. And he was a well-connected character over in Troy. And he said, "Dan, once we get power here now, how do we get the money?" And I thought that was such a funny question. And so I started to figure out how do they get the money, and all the ways that suddenly it became a speech for Roscoe's father to make.
Right. I love that speech. I love what he says about the firefighters, a bunch of pinochle players, and they get some free meals. That's all they get. And he had it all laid out, each ethnic group, each level of the judicial system, from the grand jury, down to the traffic court. That's a brilliant section. But I know there's people who've been reading the book who are anxious to ask their questions. We might as well start with some questions from the audience, Pam.
Well, actually, I have a question that's kind of a carryover from some of the questions we had in session 1 and 2 is, what's Mr. Kennedy's opinion of when the machine ended and did it? When
the machine ended and did it? Good question.
Well, the machine was Dan and Erastus for most of the life of the machine. I mean, there was other mayors, and they came and went, and then Erastus was for 11 terms, and from the 1940s to the 1980s, and a 42-year term, I think. He had the longest running consecutive time in office of any mayor in America. And he was very proud of that. And I heard somewhere in Michigan that some city had a mayor that was 43 years or something. We're going to be 43, but he checked it out and then it was only about 41.
In his papers, he saved a clipping Erasmus made Ripley's Believe It or Not. He was very proud of that. But I just did a story last year, officially since 1921, when the Democrats took City Hall, 100 years unbroken Democratic rule. And that turns out to be a record. Yeah. Now, I would like to hear you argue, does the machine exist?
I think that the machine as it was changed with Tommy Whalen. When Tommy took over, Erastus died. Tom Whalen was the head of the Common Council, and he automatically became the mayor. And then he ran for office and got elected twice. And he was a great mayor, I thought. And very fond of Tommy. He died too young. It was really sad, an automobile accident, but he changed everything. I mean, he started making actual budgets instead of
competitive bidding for the first time in the city's history. And he reformed a lot of things.
The old dinosaurs of the machine didn't like him at all. They tried to sink him and didn't succeed. I mean, he probably would have run for office again and probably would have gotten elected.
Right. But do you see a pattern? Whalen, Jennings, Sheehan? I mean, I think it's still around.
They're all Democrats, and they all continue the structure that's still there. And I still think the machine exists. It's unbeatable. It's Republicans haven't been able to elect anybody since 1921. So that's an unbelievable thing.
Right.
A century of uninterrupted power.
Right.
And
I mean, the city is changing dramatically. We look at the Common Council, Corey Ellis, a Black Common Council president, 5 or more, 6 council members of color. That's a change, but still Democratic, all deep blue.
Every one of them, Jerry Jennings made changes that were not to the liking of the old timers, but the old timers just died away and fell off the cliff and disappeared. I mean, it was attrition as well as willful change by some of these new kids on the block, Jerry and Tommy, and like Kathy Sheehan. I mean, she's moving over to live in Denbrook Street area as our home. That was very, very different from anybody else.
Corning technically did not live in the city. He maintained a shadow home, as you know, on Lake Avenue. He technically should not have been mayor. He lived in the town of Bethlehem, but we'll give him a pass on that. But that's a great question. Is there another one, Pam?
I think Chris Hale's got a question.
Thanks. Mr. Kennedy, I know we all really enjoyed the book. I was very fast. This is a question about the writing process. I was just fascinated and enjoyed the names of the characters so much. And not only the characters that had speaking parts, but the names of so many individuals that you mention in the background paragraphs. So what's the process of coming up with what must be hundreds of names in the book? Is there a master list of names that you choose from?
I've never asked him that question. That's a great question.
I don't know. We could just go through the list of names of people. Who were they? Elisha Fitzgibbon. Well, once I get the family name. I just made the Cornings into the Fitzgibbons, and Roscoe Conway had to be Irish, and he was. It was like the Nolans of Albany, Nolan, the Quinn and Nolan Brewery, and Michael Nolan was the mayor of Albany for 2 terms, and got was he impeached, or was he kicked out of office, or was he? But anyway,
was voted out.
He was voted out. But anyway, he owned the brewery, and that, I gave that whole thing to Roscoe, and I was just thinking about that today because I'm doing it for a new book now, and it's like the moment when the book becomes real is when you finally have a list of who these people are that you've been thinking about. You know, you have to get specific, and I have this genealogy thing here. This is my
He was digging into the archives before we started.
And I was just looking to see what happened in Roscoe's life, and you know, it's full of, every book has a genealogy in it, and it's different, and they accumulate, and you know,
He's got it all plotted out, that's for sure. But I have a follow-up question, and I've never asked this either. Do those names change during drafts? If you start with certain names for a couple drafts and then you don't like it and you shift? Because I know how many drafts you go through, many drafts.
Yeah, some, you know, I changed them. I can't remember now what the main characters were, but I've changed the names of the characters from time to time, and I have to go back into the novel and change it all the way through, because it's, you know, I get through 100 pages or something, and I decided that I don't like this name.
Right.
And but it's but I do that with everything. And you know, I'm putting together a book now of plays and screenplays, and I've rewritten my novels. Some of my novels, like Flaming Corsage and Billy Phil and Ironweed and Legs and The Very Old Bones, and plays, and they're all, but they're radically different. I mean, I just finished a rewrite of.
That's okay, we'll let that go.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. But
Someone will grab it.
Yeah.
I think Catherine Sheridan has had her hand up for a little bit with a question.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
We can't, we're waiting for the question here.
Here she comes.
I was wondering about the 1970s potential insurrection in Albany politics of one Teresa Cook, who started up in the PTA at School 9 in Pine Hills, worked her way up to the comptroller of the county of Albany, much to the chagrin of the political machine, and would, but for 7,000 votes, have been the first Albany County executive. Why do you think that campaign failed? Why wasn't she more successful? Why didn't she go all the way? Do you have any idea, guys?
Well, I could. There was in the first place, Albany is a Democratic town, and it has been. And then that is just the way it has been since 1921. And it's very hard for Republicans to field a candidate. There was in 1968 a breakthrough. A lot of Republicans elected an attorney, district attorney.
Proskin.
Arnold Proskin. Dan Button got elected to Congress.
Right.
And there was Fred Field and other, Tom Brown, the guys got elected to the Senate and the Assembly. It was a revolution of a sort. And there has been that sort of promotion for good government type candidates. And they were abundant through the years, but they never got anywhere. But this one was in the Rockefeller years, and Rockefeller was very popular. The Republican Party was having a renaissance, and a lot of those people got on Rocky's coattails and got elected. And it was a phenomenon. But eventually, the machine took over again. They got rid of Arnold Proskin. I think he got elected twice, maybe. But and Dan Button got elected twice. But then they brought Sam Stratton in, who was sort of alien to them. He was a Schenectadian, and they brought him in, and Dan and Sam beat Dan, and Sam was a great vote getter at that time. And anyway, that was. And the other thing is that they stole a lot of votes. There were fixed elections, and in Ironweed, Francis Phelan comes home to a Democratic primary because he knows they're passing out money for voting, and he votes 21 times, and he gets arrested. And his son, Billy Phelan, puts bail up for them, and that's how they meet for the first time in 22 years. And he left the family and went off and played baseball. And couldn't stand it because he had dropped his son, and so on. And the baby died at 13 days old. And but the whole idea of the fixed elections are, I remember wondering how, there used to be registrations of Democratic voters, and on the registrations, there were more Democrats than there were people in the city.
And the other thing Bill has written about, and I've talked to old-time reporters that covered it, I mean, it was Democratic with a capital D, but it was not Democratic with a small d. When they had the county machine slate of candidates, they would take a bet. How long would it take to approve all of them? There was never any discussion, never any dissent. When Dan had said you were the candidate, you were the candidate, and it was 1 minute, 38 seconds generally. I mean, it was that's how they ran the party. A great example that I talk about in the Corning book too, and I'm trying to remember his name, but he was a printer at the Times Union. He hung around. He was a loyal ward healer, and Dan and company decided he was ready. They put him up. He won a seat in the state assembly, and someone at the paper asked him, "Hey, Frankie, what are you going to do now?" He said, "Whatever they tell me to do," which is how it worked.
Now, I remember I asked a couple of real insiders once. I mean, when you think back on the fixed elections, like how many votes would they have fixed? How many? I mean, one guy said 35,000, and another guy said 25,000. And I remember saying at the time that this was how you distinguished a conservative from a liberal in Albany, was your count of the votes. But it wasn't that many. It was substantial. Right. But Dewey found this out, and he exposed that it didn't make any difference because Dewey couldn't get a conviction. I'm talking about Dewey when he was governor, and he was also running for president against Roosevelt in 44 and 48. And he wanted to expose the political machine for what it was, in the same way he had put Lucky Luciano and a lot of the mob in jail in New York City when he was district attorney down there. Now he was the governor, and he was doing the same thing, and he wanted to be the knight in shining armor. And so he conducted this vast investigation, $500,000 back in the 40s, huge thing, and he couldn't get any convictions because Dan control the courts, and they control the grand juries. handpicked grand juries. I mean, so it had it known. It had everybody in every place of power that you could exercise it, and they exercised it.
Yes, that's a great question. Who has another question, Pam?
I think Cynthia Fox is next, and then I'm going to read some out of the chat.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you. This has been a really great 3 weeks reading your book and discussing it. And I wanted to sort of follow up on Paul's first question and then what Christine had asked, and a literary question about the physical aspect of Roscoe and how you came up with that. Because he's, to me, you know, he's this big guy and this long beard, and he's chewing on Hershey bars all the time, and he seems very, I don't know, I have a little bit of a hard time reconciling this image of him with his personality. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
I was thinking of Falstaff as a character who has great appeal, and his girth and his appetites are mythical, and I felt that was an attribute that I could put into. I've known people like this guy. I had a good friend who models his demeanor and his beard and his paunch, and it was a well-dressed guy, and he was a very good-looking guy. I mean, a handsome dude, but it doesn't go. It's not impossible to have a well-dressed, handsome-looking fat fellow. It's possible in the world. And that's what Roscoe was.
Yeah, he seemed a little out of his time. He seemed like, and maybe I just was reading it wrong, but he seemed maybe more like,
He seemed a little out of his time.
Like maybe from the 1920s rather than the 1940s or something. I don't know.
Well, he was from the 20s. I mean,
He fought in the war.
He was in World War I. I mean, he's a figure from that period. And was a flamboyance in a kind of a jazz era, Prohibition era, you know, like an anything goes time of life in this country, just the same as the 60s were with dope and the hippies, the hippie movement and the Beatles and things. And we had jazz music back then, and all the flappers and you know, and the booze and the saloons and the secret speakeasies and the kind of lifestyle that was current at the time. And you know, some things change, but some people continued to live that lifestyle. Even in the 50s and 60s, in the state 50s, and you know, and on into the 60s, they regained their footing. And they were at home again if they were of a certain age. But it was, I think that the individualized life like that, which seems out of style, but there's always somebody like that you meet in your life who's born into another era. That's what sets them apart. It's an individuality that is cultivated, if not, you know, maybe they were born that way. We're born as extroverts or, you know, wild-headed people, and liked a good time. Roscoe liked a good time. He was also a smart lawyer.
Yeah, I thought Roscoe, there was a sadness to him. I think he was emblematic of the machine that was kind of you know, being pressured. He ate too much, drank too much. He kind of let himself go to seed. He had a lot of regret and worry. He was a very complex, complicated person because he felt a lot of pressures on him, I thought. And he didn't really control his appetites, but that's the kind of person he was. But he's also, like you said, you wanted somebody who was very articulate, funny, insightful. Dan wasn't that. Dan was a two-syllable speaker, you know.
The machine was run by very smart people. Dan was a smart guy, but he was, he couldn't be a spokesman. He had a 5th grade education, and I wanted somebody like Dan's brother, Ed, who graduated from Union College, and he became a lawyer. And he was a very, very smart and savvy character. And he was running the party until he died in his own hand in 1938. And it was unusual. That's why I put his death, impose it on Elisha in the novel.
Yeah.
There was a lot about the machine that was very likable. Most of the people, I know, the mayor was an enormously popular man and a very smart guy. Rastus Corning was a brilliant character.
Phi Beta, yeah.
And he loved history, and he was able to talk with anybody, academic level, whatever it was. It was something that. But he didn't do it. He didn't talk like that publicly. He didn't want to isolate himself and become one of those, what the right wing now calls the libs, and the academic libs, and hanging around the university for 40 years. I've gotten to know them all out there. And it's been nothing like what the right thinks of it as. It's a mixture of so many different kinds of personalities, and I represent the academic world. And
I like how you also capture the machine and its complexity and its darkness and its light. They were benevolent to the point that they did provide coal, they provided turkeys, they gave jobs, but they could be ruthless. If you cross them, you could lose your job, your assessment could go through the roof, you could find yourself threatened and intimidated. You show the dark side of the machine as well. It wasn't all light and honey.
Well, it wasn't in real life either. I mean, Erastus was notorious for that. I mean, everybody got punished if they crossed the party.
Right.
If they did anything in line with the Republican voting or support for the candidate. And I mean, Erastus didn't forget, and Dan didn't forget. And they punished them. They exiled them or whatever.
Right. Who's got another question?
That's kind of a lead into the next question, actually, is what's the difference between the machine and the Democratic Party?
Well, the machine was more like a Republican Party is today. Not today. Today is different. But like the Republican Party in Ronald Reagan's era. That was where so many of the minds of the leadership of the Democrats were in Albany. I mean, they were right wing in a lot of things. I mean, they were just, but not when it came to voting for anything that had to do with electing members of the Democratic Party. I remember when George McGovern was running here, George was setting up offices of, campaign headquarters in cities around the country. And they set one up in Albany. And, and they were, a little left of center. George was considered somewhat of a radical in those days, but not like some lefties today, but he was considered radical, I would say. And anyway, he did not mesh with the political machine here with Dan and Erastus. And so that when they started behaving on their own, independently of the local party to support George, and it was I don't know how many weeks they were in town, but finally Dan moved in on them and told them to get the hell out of town, and they folded their tents and went. I don't know, maybe they went to Schenectady. I don't know where they went, but they went away. And what happened was when the vote came in, the vote was counted. George didn't carry any major city except Albany. Albany just went for him, but he didn't. I don't think he carried Rochester or Buffalo,
Right.
Yonkers. I'm not sure about that, but it's very close to that. And that was the way it was. I mean, they just they were independent-minded in terms of their own personal, and this went with a lot of the Irish, and which what the leadership was, and it was they had become conservative in their in a lot of their politics, and Dan was that.
I mean, after so many decades, I felt the machine, whatever ideas they had, they were gone. They were simply trying to hold on to power. They had no policy. They had no foresight. They really held the city back in so many ways. They were strictly.
What year are you talking about that?
From the 60s through when Dan died and Erastus died, 60s through the early 80s.
Yeah, well, even when Rockefeller was in town, I remember when Rockefeller proposed the South Mall, and Dan and Erastus were militantly against it. And then something changed. But before the change came, I remember they were saying, no, anything he wants, forget about it. He's not going to take, we're going to knock the neighborhoods down. That's where their vote was. The whole Italian vote, they took half the Italian neighborhood and knocked it down to build a mall. And the Jewish neighborhood in the South End, a lot of the Irish down there, they were, all of that was taken away and they were not replaced. And I remember Dan's line to Rockefeller was, "The hell with you, let grass grow in the streets. We're not going to do it. We're
Right.
not going to go for the modern thrust and the change of the city." And, they didn't.
I mean, the machine makes great novels, drama, screenplays. But when I was doing my Corning book, I took a chapter on, okay, what did Erastus accomplish as the longest tenured mayor, 42 years? And I titled that, I remember, Long on Years, Short on Accomplishments. I couldn't point to that many things other than staying in office all those years that they had actually done for the city. One good thing in historic Albany is the, beneficiary, we all are, the great architecture. He refused urban renewal money in the 60s when they were knocking down large sections of cities across America. Dan didn't want the federal money with strings attached.
Yeah, but that's because he didn't want federal control.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
But that saved some of our great architecture, I think.
Well, one of the things,
ironically,
when Rockefeller was building when he was building the South Mall, that the Rockefeller entrance to the mall is, will come from Broadway 787. It goes right up into the mall. The plan was to take that right through Washington Park and then connect it over to Northern Boulevard. And it was going to be a circle around the whole city.
Right.
And everybody in Center Square said, whoa, you know,
Right.
when they got their backs up, and Erastus got his back up at the same time, and he said no. And that was no.
Right.
I mean, whatever power he had, he was able to exercise, and he did not let that happen.
Right.
And so
And that's why Historic Albany Foundation is here.
that's
That
there
was,
you
that was
go.
our impetus. Enough
Yeah.
was enough. 98
Yes.
acres was enough.
Yes.
So let's get to a couple more questions because they're actually piling up.
Excellent.
The next question is, can you give an example of what would happen to somebody who challenged the machine?
Jeez.
I can give an exact example because I use it and I track them down, people that got fired from their state jobs because they either worked at a Republican campaign headquarters or stepped out of line. And Erastus would contact the head of Office of General Services for New York State, and that person would be either demoted or fired from their state position. I saw that direct evidence. We have other examples.
Well, I could tell you my father, I was working for the Times Union, and I was writing a lot of anti-machine stories because that's what was happening. I was covering these South End community organizations, and I was covering all of the protesters against the way the church and the politicians were treating the South End and Arbor Hill, and I got into a lot of. I covered a lot of politics, and it was so much of it was what was happening was that there were these groups that were forming were really anti-machine, and I was reflecting that. Obviously, I wasn't inventing it; I was reporting on it, and I got told, I said, you know, by the machine, you know, and not by the machine, but a lot of people started telling me, you got to be careful, you know, whatever can happen, you know. And one of the things that happened was my father was fired. He was a bailiff in the court. He was a deputy sheriff, and he worked in the courts. He handled the grand juries. He was he loved the job. It was one of the best jobs he ever had. He was a very gregarious character. He loved knowing all the lawyers, and they loved him. I mean, he was doing a great job. I mean, but suddenly he was let go. I mean, he was old, but you know that didn't mean a thing to the machine, and they'd keep you on until you were dead and gone, and still pay you, but if they wanted to. But it was something that they did to get at me. They didn't get me. I mean, they get my father. But he wrote to some of the politicians, a couple of politicians, to find out what happened. They never told him what happened. One of the politicians came up to me years later and said, "You forgot your father." And I knew exactly what he was saying. And I said to him, I didn't forget my father. I said, I took care of my father. When my father lost his job, he came and lived with me. And he was 5 years out here where I am now. And he spent the last 5 years of his life here. Pretty happy years. And but he was very old, and he'd been sick and so on. It wasn't that an unusual thing, but that was a you know, you forgot your father. It was a high-level politician. So I show you that. I mean, that's, if they did that, you know, I'm sure there's hundreds of stories like that.
Yeah, that hit close to home. I'd forgotten that. Did your father ever talk to you and say, "Hey, Bill, I'm getting heat. Can you lay off some of these stories?"
Yeah, he called me up once and he got a call from one of my cousins who was committeeman for the city. He said, he called my father and said, "Look, you know, your son and cousin is writing these things." And I remember one of my other cousins said to me one day when I was in the middle of writing these things, I met him outside the paper, and he said to me, "Hey, you're a maverick, you're a renegade, aren't you?" You know? And I said, "I don't think so. I'm just telling the news how it is." And well, I was more than that. I was definitely writing news analysis and talking about giving equal time to these voices that had no voice before. And it was unusual what we were doing at the newspaper in those days. But anyway, that happened, and my father called me up, and I said, I yelled at him. I said, "I'm not going to stop doing this. I don't care whatever they think." But that was what happened as a consequence. They fired him.
Well, our next question actually takes us back to the book. Did the author leave us any hints that we could surmise that Alex may have been Gilby's father? And was it possible that Elisha was counting on Roscoe to create a fiction that would protect Alex's career?
My take on that is that Alex was Gilby's father, and Elisha knew it, and Roscoe comes to know it, and comes to remember the day that it may have happened or something, you know, election victory, and Pamela was around for it, and she was dancing with Alex, and he was 17 years old, and so on. And so it happened. But Elisha, when he died, he said, Roscoe will figure it out. Roscoe will understand it. And he tells his Gladys, his secretary, leaves a note and so on. But he's convinced of it, and she may have told him. I don't know exactly how it happened, but we won't know that. But when he comes to it, it's a liability for Alex, and Roscoe sees that Elisha saw that, and that's why Elisha did what he did, and he was protecting Alex by doing what he did. And it wasn't a fictional thing. It was a real thing. It was speculation until Roscoe figures it out.
So our next question is, you seem to find ghosts useful in your books, and they make an appearance in Roscoe. Do you want to talk about that a little bit as a literary device?
Well, I'm very fond of ghosts. I mean, I have been for literature forever. You know, they abound in literature. Ghosts everywhere you look. I mean, ghosts in Shakespeare, ghost of Hamlet, Dickens. How about Dickens? The Ghost of Christmas Past, Marley's Ghost, and you know, they. Sometimes they're not ghosts. There's so many stories that I loved are fantasies. The fantasy element of any individual's life is very real. It's an authentic thing. It's not just a fantasy. It is a fantasy, but the fantasy has power. Power of suggestion, the power of forcing a decision on the individual. I mean, the way our brain works is that our unconscious life, which is a dream life, is constantly affecting us, and we don't even know what it comes to. And that's exactly what I felt like I wanted to represent. And I did it in the ink truck. I mean, I did it in legs. I mean, certain things that happen in all the books. It's there in, throughout Ironweed. I just wrote a scene the other day, wrote a new ending to the play I wrote from Very Old Bones, and I have a new ending for that wasn't in the novel. It's about the return of a character as a ghost, and it's brief and it's non-intrusive. It doesn't, but what it does is it complexifies the character of Francis Phelan, to whom it has happened throughout Ironweed, and the ghosts are part of his imagination. They are him talking to himself in a certain way, but they are dramatized as conversations in real life, which makes it very, dramatic and readable.
So I wanted to ask you, I think there's a clear influence. You're reading a lot of South American writers, magical realism, particularly Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who you interviewed and knew well. What was the influence of those writers on bringing in this magical realism?
It's the same as, I grew up writing the same things that Garcia Marquez wrote. I mean, they called it magical realism when all of the South American writers started to do it, and he was one of them. But there were a lot of other writers who were writing in Latin America who were also doing the similar things. The guy that blow up, the Argentine short story writer, novelist. I can't remember the name.
Thinking of his name too.
Anyway, but Mario Vargas Llosa.
Vargas is.
No, that's not Vargas Llosa. He's a Peruvian, but this is. I mean, the Kafka did this, and Virginia Woolf did it, and Shakespeare, the Greeks, they're full of ghosts and gods and spirits coming down, and our life is full of that sort of thing. I found I was reading the same things that Garcia Marquez was when I interviewed him. It was, we were of a same age, same, coming into the movie business, and at the same time, of course, he did a lot more than I did, but his books are, remarkably more circulated than mine. But I'm talking about the influences on the writer who created the books. I was creating mine at the same time he was creating his. I was not influenced by that. I remember the ink truck when I was Billy and I. Right. I had known him. I had known that well in those days. When they came out in the 60s, 70 or something before he comes out, and I've got 2 books already almost finished.
Right.
Well, 3. I had one that never got published. I've written 3 novels. Anyway, that's, it's pervasive, though, that form of writing. And Bergman did it in the movie business, and Fellini did it. And, so many other, Buñuel did it.
Well, I think that kind of
Well,
is a launch into our next question
Yes,
about
next question.
There's an occasional page where Roscoe sees flying head to the Pope. And what was the source of these sidelights? Were they dream sequences, or, you know, where was that connected to the rest of the book?
The question again was Roscoe and the Pope?
Where there were sort of these single pages within the book that were almost like dream sequences, or something that was totally separate from the book. Where did that fit into it?
Well, I don't know where they fit in. I just feel like they fit in because I invented them.
Well, and that's your prerogative as the author, obviously.
I would write some. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Your prerogative as the author, of course.
Right, you know.
It's your world.
But it became, it was, you know, it's an extension of what I was doing with the ghosts. I mean, it's the sort of ghosts that come in, the ghost of a pope or whatever it is, or the ghosts in the very opening sequence of Roscoe. Roscoe and the Wind.
Yeah.
Did you read that?
Yeah.
The first couple of paragraphs.
That year, an ill wind blew across the city, over the city, and threatened to destroy flower pots, family fortunes, reputations, true love, and several types of virtue. Roscoe, moving along the road, felt the wind at his back and heard the wind-blown voices. "Do you know where the ill wind comes from, Roscoe?" the voices asked him. "No," he said, "but I'm not sure the wind is really ill. His illness may be overrated, maybe even fraudulent." "Do people think there's such a thing as a good ill wind?" they asked. "Of course," he answered. "And when it comes, it billows the sails of our city. It nourishes our babies, comforts our aliens, gives purpose to our dead, tranquilizes our useless, straightens our crooked, and vice versa. The ill wind is a none such and demands close attention."
And it goes on. And those are ways of saying things in a different way from realistic prose that becomes banal. And I'm constantly trying to use language in a way that is not traditional like that. And it's one of the reasons, or tell a story in a way that's not traditional necessarily. But I just don't know what else to say about why I do that. But I feel that it's something that, if it's said in a particular way, I think that language is what novels are in large measure about first. And that if you get the language of it right, it's original. It's different. It'll be different from everybody else's because we all speak a different language, and our personality comes out in it, and our personalities are all different. And so I'm trying to, you know, create Roscoe as a man who thinks in these very strange ways, and he's saying things about politics and about public life and about life in general, and talking about sexuality or political liability or whatever it is that what's on the subject of the moment. he will say it in a different way. I'm cliches, and I don't want to repeat myself in the format of cliches. So that's why I do it.
I mean, that's why he's a great character. He's a great talker. He's so philosophical. He's witty. He's tragic. I mean, his language that you give to Roscoe is brilliant. Yeah.
Well, and that's the kind of character I wanted. Francis Phelan is a witty guy,
Right?
But he doesn't speak like Roscoe. He doesn't have that kind of language at his disposal for public consumption. But when I was writing Ironweed, you're going to look at Ironweed, and there's about 4 or 5 different ways in which the prose of that novel is represented. And sometimes it seems like I'm the author of it. And I thought that that's what I was doing when I was writing it for the first time. But then after a while, I realized that I wasn't writing it like that. I had Francis and Phelan in mind when I was writing it, but what it came to be was like Francis's, say, 3 different levels of communication. I mean, the way he speaks he drops his INGs, and he doesn't, he's got a lot of slang. He's kind of a joke a minute, and even in the most dire circumstances. And then there's this kind of internal, unpunctuated, more regular language, school book language or something, whatever it is that's in his head, that's commonplace in the way he thinks about a lot of things. And then there is the profundity of any human being. When you access that, you know what's really going on down there in the middle of his brain, and in his dreams, and in his fantasies, and his waking dreams, and his total unconscious. I mean, what the unconscious is doing is talking, is Francis talking in a different way to himself. So that has meaning, that because it's Francis's language, and that's what I'm talking about. The language of the book is primary, and because that's what individualizes it, and what individualizes the character as well.
Great question. Is there another one, Pam?
We've got questions backed up, but why don't we take a live question? Jerry DeSeves had her hand up for a while, so why don't we go to Jerry?
Hi, Bill. Just wanted to ask you to address what was going on in Troy. You talked about the cockfights and things, and actually they happened in my neighborhood. So I wanted to ask you if you could address some of that, and what the connection was between the politics in Troy and the politics in Albany.
Well, they're very similar. The Democrats were over there for a long time, and then the Republicans took over, and they've been there for a long time. But when Dan was there, there were the Democratic Troy, as I remember, a good many. Eddie McDonough was over there. And, what's his name before? Who was the Democratic leader before Eddie?
Yeah, well, the Fogartys.
Who?
Fogartys were.
Fogartys?
Were big.
I don't know, Troy.
Fogartys.
I'll think of it in a minute. But,
Yeah.
It's they were similar, and that question that we talked about earlier was how do you get the money? That was the Troy, when it was a Troy Democrat, and he was at Dan O'Connell's house, and he said that asked that question to Dan, and he tried to exercise it too when they did win. They did. And you know what? Troy could have been the subject of this novel in a lot of ways, but it was Albany's uniqueness in the solidarity of the party and controlling the entire city for such a long time. That's what impressed me, and the absoluteness of the control, and how it was really Dan's doing, and he was this guy with the 5th grade education who comes out of the Navy as a sailor and campaigns in the South End with the Irish and gets elected to an assessorship and turns the whole. For 20 years, the Democrats couldn't elect anybody from 1899 to 1921. They couldn't get anywhere near City Hall. But Dan got in 1919 and built a wing of the party, and Packy McCabe, who ran the party, they threw him out. I mean, he didn't throw him out, but he was a nice guy, and he could never elect anybody, just the way the Republicans became after that. But in the days of those years, I mean, from the middle 90s on, and especially from 99 to 21, Billy Barnes's machine ran Albany City and County, and had a great influence in the state. And he was a president maker also. He was a governor maker and a president maker. And he was a newspaper man, Billy Barnes. I use him in the novel.
Grandson of Thurlow Weed, who was also a major figure in American politics and history. That's a great question. Who has another one, Pam?
Well, actually, it's funny. Billy Barnes is the name of my brother. But anyway, the next question is, where was Roscoe heading the night he was on the boat?
Where was Roscoe heading the night he was on the boat? I don't recall.
I was just leaving town, maybe, but it was more who knows for sure, but he was on his way. He said, either way, I can use a little music, because it was the end of a day, end of an era, and so on.
I also, you have a great advantage, because you have just read the book. You've been talking about it the last 2 weeks. Bill wrote this 20 years ago. I can't tell you how many tens of thousands of words and books he's written since. So I don't expect him to remember. I read it 20 years ago when it came out. I've reread sections of it, but you guys you could definitely beat us in Roscoe trivia tonight, for sure.
All right, next up is, why such a difference in the education of the two O'Connell brothers?
Difference in the education of the O'Connell brothers. That was historical facts too.
The education of the two O'Connell brothers.
Yeah.
You mean Dan and Ed? Is that?
Mm-hmm.
I presume. Well, Ed was I mentioned he graduated from Union College, and there were 5 O'Connell brothers.
Yeah.
It was Dan and Ed and Packy and
Solly.
And is that it?
You got me. I don't know.
Maybe it was 4.
I could look it up. Yeah.
Anyway, there were those brothers, and Solly was more like Dan. He may have gone a little further at school, but he was not a political intellectual or anything like that. He was but Ed was. I mean, Ed was a very educated guy, and he was like on the same education level with Edmund Corning, who was Erastus's father, who was also part of the founding of the machine. And it was those guys all grew up together. They hunted and fished together, and they lived in the same more or less neighborhood at South End, and Corning's lived on Corning Hill, and right up the street with 4th Avenue, and North Pearl was Blackjack O'Connell's saloon, and across the street from St. Anne's Church. And it was There were guys in the South End neighborhood, and they had a common ground, and one of the common things was politics.
And cockfighting.
And cockfighting.
They both love to bet
they're all
on
in
and
it
fight
together.
chickens and.
And that's where Troy came in. Troy was a Fogarty's cockpit in South Troy was a great famous place, a stop on the circuit of cockfighters. So, you know, I remember who was the judge of federal judge in Albany, was a buddy of Dan's.
Conway? Was it Ned Conway? No.
Oh, I can't.
Your memory is always better than mine, Bill. I can't remember.
But anyway,
I forget what I wrote last
I
week.
interviewed him at great length, and
The red light is gone, and
he's a
no-
wonderful
no
guy.
longer muted.
His
Well,
father.
it doesn't bring.
Somebody's
attention-
unmuted. I'm
My
sorry.
question, I already,
We're hearing some background noise, but yeah. So cockfighting. I when I was writing my corning book, I traipsed all over Dan O'Connell's property on Beaver Dam Road, overlooking the top of the Helderbergs, and out in the woods, you could still see all the chicken coops, all kind of broken down, and his big garage barn was where the old timers told me they had chicken fights, and it was substantial. He bred them, he sold them. There was quite a bit of money wagered on chicken fights, cockfights, even though it was illegal in that day, just as it is now. They still were very active, and obviously they controlled, you know, the cops, the grand jury, the courts, so they weren't worried about getting busted, I guess.
There was a kind of camaraderie around the cockfighters that Dan and his brothers and this judge, God, I can't believe his name. I can't forget his name. He was an Irishman, and his father, is it Fogarty?
Oh, Fogarty was.
Who was Pitt? Was Foley? Judge
Oh,
Foley.
Judge Foley.
That's who it
He's-
was.
he's-
Foley. And he said, I don't care what you said. If you told me that Dan O'Connell just murdered his mother and father down on State and Pearl, he said, I would say, well, that's too bad, but Dan is a great guy. and that's the way he felt that, you know, he would always say that about it. And that's the way it was. You know, his politics didn't really matter very much.
Yeah.
If he moved to the right or whatever.
I heard
For
the
most of the
variations
people.
on this many times. He may have been a bastard, but he was our bastard.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, yeah. Good questions. Who else? Keep them coming, Pam. Do you want me to look into the chat or?
Actually, I've got one because fellow author and journalist Terry Galway's with us tonight again.
I
And
saw Terry there. He is, wow.
he joined
Awesome.
us last week. And so he is back tonight. And his comment is, last week we wondered if there were if any of the political characters stood for anything other than patronage. Pat Moynihan said that when the Irish came to power, they didn't know what to do with it. But the Irish wasn't getting any power, the point after being powerless in Ireland.
Huh. That's a great Moynihan quote, that the Irish didn't know what to do when they got power, and the whole patronage was really what kept them running. That's a great question, Terry.
I think that's Pat was speaking in a way that said that the Irish didn't know what to do with it because he was expecting them to do something, you know, original and you know, central to morality of the day and uplift and so on. But they knew exactly what to do with it because Dan had been studying Tammany Hall for years, and they knew exactly how to behave. And the imprimatur was on them from the get-go, and they became Tammany North, and they worked with Tammany forever. And they had them falling outs in here and there, but there was, by and large, there was great solidarity. And I remember Dan talking about him, and he was FDR had a big feud with Tammany, and he broke it in a lot of ways. And he said, I don't know why he was so mad at Tammany. And he said, great people. And that's the way Dan felt about it. But he was, I mean, they put it into place almost immediately, and they never changed. I mean, however you got power and used it, that was what they did. And they knew every which way to do it. How do you get the money? And also, they were, we know benign, not benign. They were malign in so many ways in terms of the public trough and the way they, the graft was.
Right. But what I think set the O'Connell Corning machine apart, one, is they had the street level and the elite blue blood WASP level, and they had a power because they spanned all those levels. But also, Dan was not as greedy as Curley in Boston, which is what hung him up. I mean, he was ostentatious with his cars and his houses. And, I was in Dan's house in Whitehall. I know you were very average. He had kind of a ratty recliner that he steady daily guests, including Mayor Corning. His house on Beaver Dam Road, it had an incredible view. It did have an early indoor swimming pool, but it wasn't extravagant. He didn't drive extravagant cars. He didn't seem to have, some Swiss bank account. So I think he did spread it around more than some of these other, machine, Boss Tweed. Their own extravagance ended up being their downfall in a way. That's why I think Dan survived for so long.
Yeah, there was a greed that Dan didn't have when Dan's acquisitions went into the party, and
Right.
he had a safe in his basement, and they used to put the money every night. The cops would go up to Dan's house and watch the money go into the safe. Chief of detectives, whoever it was with it, and that's the way it was. And
He was one of those CEOs that he
would never-
reinvested in his business. He put it back into the business. He didn't give himself a $5 million salary. He was a benevolent CEO of his era, socially conscious. Anyway, who's got another question?
I know we talked about this a little bit, I think, last week, and we weren't really sure. Where is the Tivoli estate located? And was it based on a real place?
Tivoli estate, you mean the Van Rensselaer estate of
Tivoli in the novel.
Where Veronica lived, Veronica's house.
Tivoli estate. I'm lost. I've lost that. I'm not sure where is.
Because
I don't know
we were guessing probably maybe the Sage estate.
It was this opulent mansion and property that where she lived. I thought it related to Ironweed and the house you had in mind that later became part of the movie out New Scotland Avenue in a way. But I don't know what you had in mind for that. Could have been the Van Rensselaer Manor.
Well, one of the I was.
Corning Estate. It could have been.
Mm-hmm.
Tivoli. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on this. It's something I've forgotten. But as I recall, Englewood Place and State Street and the Willard Street, that whole area of the tall apartment buildings, and not really tall, but and then the opulent houses on on the streets there that were mixed in with less opulent, but it was a very upscale neighborhood. And
Yeah, Inglewood has some mansions on it, on the edge of the park, western
Some
edge of
that
the
are
park.
unfortunately no longer there. Yeah, it's a wonderful street. I think
I-
and there's a lot of comments in the chat, but we don't have a lot of other questions. So if anybody has a question, raise your hand.
You're making Bill go to the archives. He's looking in the binder right now. It could have been wholly invented, you know, this is his world, and a lot of it is not sort of thinly veiled or based on
Right.
any historical.
Well, and you're right. We all just read it in the past few weeks. And I think, you know, we were guessing because I think some of the descriptions had the estate somewhere between Albany and Menands. And we were thinking like Sage Estate, or obviously you know.
The Schuyler had that estate along the flats, their summer home.
The Van
That's a much-
Rensselaer Manor, which is, you know, obviously no longer there, but there were a lot of opulent houses between Albany and that area, you know,
Right.
before Loudonville even became Loudonville.
Yes. While we have everyone still here, I don't know what time we're looking at, but I would like to make a plug for Monday night, this coming Monday night at Capitol Repertory Theater. The Writers Institute and Cap Rep and Proctors are collaborating. We're bringing in Shar White, the playwright of The True, which spins this forward into the Polly Noonan, Erastus Corning era. And you've got Charlie Ryan in it. You've got, you know, Betty Corning makes an appearance. So this is a tremendous play, and it's kind of a preview to the run at Cap Rep. And if you want to see it, I just went and got tickets. It's selling out. It's going to run April 1st through 24th at Cap Rep. And this is, you know, this is Roscoe Next Generation, kind of 2.0. And it's a fantastic play that really delves into Albany politics in a different way. You know, it's not Bill Kennedy, it's Shar White, but it's very interesting. So I would highly recommend. I actually think that's close to selling out. They're free tickets, but you have to go online to the Cap Rep website or at NYS Writers Institute.org and you know, sign up for your tickets. But that's going to be a fun night. Bill's going to be there. I'm going to be there. Maggie Mancinelli Cahill, and a lot of the Albany you know, historians and political folks.
No, this has been absolutely fantastic. I mean, like I said, thanks to Dave Hochfelder for moderating session 1 and 2, and thank you to Paul, and especially Mr. Kennedy for giving us your time tonight and going over this book that everybody has so much enjoyed. There's so many levels to this book, between the architecture. We didn't even touch on that tonight. I mean, living at the Kenmore and the Kenmore coming back to life. And, you know, for me, sometimes when I read these books, I just absolutely love being able to visit the neighborhoods and the buildings, and some of them that are not there anymore. And this has just been absolutely fantastic. And thank you again for your time tonight. It's been great getting your insights into this book that we've all spent so much time with this winter.
Yeah, I see a lot of familiar faces. I would also thank David Hochfelder, a colleague at the University of Albany. And if you've not been on his site, 98 Acres in Albany, it is an incredible amount of work that he and his wife and other people have done to kind of reclaim that lost 98 acres that the South Mall took over, and to trace those families and businesses that were disappeared. It's a tremendous work of public history and reclaiming, you know, destroyed, displaced families and businesses. So I would highly recommend that website as well.
I have
Bill's got
a clue.
He's found a Tivoli
Tivoli.
breadcrumb.
The family was German Jewish, and they were part of the influx from the 1840s, you know, the liberal revolution in Europe in the 1840s, in 1848 or so. And when they came into Albany, they became a very important and politically and economically, and they were not poor. They were some of them were very wealthy, and they started. And this family I was tracing was one particular Jewish family that came in and had a great industrial background, and their family made $1 zillion, and they're still members of it alive today. And I've interviewed quite a few of them. And anyway, that's it. And they lived on Madison Avenue up near St. Vincent's. And they lived also elsewhere in a number of rather upscale houses. But anyway, that's who they are.
This has been very enjoyable. I'd also like to give a shout out. I see Suzanne Roberson is there. These archives and so much of Bill's work, Suzanne has been his assistant and part of the Writers Institute for many novels, many books. She's indispensable, isn't she, Bill?
Absolutely.
I mean, she's incredible.
She's going to be around here tomorrow, I think.
Excellent. There she is. We see her. Yep.
Well, on that take, maybe I have one final question to Mr. Kennedy. What are you working on now?
Well, I just said a little bit ago, I'm working on a book I call The Six Pack, and it's 6 plays and 4 plays, theatrical plays, and 2 screenplays. I'm not sure what's going to happen with this book. I mean, I'm just sent it off. I've been working on the last play, the one I call The Light on Colony Street, and I really like this play. It's only had 1 reading since I wrote it. I mean, I wrote it back in the 70s and something like that. There's a 1-act play called Dinner at the Phelan's. It's about the Phelan family. And eventually it became very old bones. And then I wrote the novel. And then I wrote a play from the novel. And then I wrote another play from the novel, another play from the novel. And finally, I've threw them all out and rewrote as of about 2 years ago. And I started the play from scratch, and it's very, very different from the novel now. And it's the same characters and the same plot. It's the death of the mother of the family and the historical background of the murder of one of the women in the family by her husband, who thought she was a demon. Anyway, that's a play I think very highly of, and I have a couple of screenplay on Billy and Corsage, and my play Grand View, and I got a 1-act play about the interrupted apotheosis of Jack Legg's Diamond, about the death of Jack Legg's Diamond as a vaudeville show. And it's and then there's 6 plays already.
Great.
And anyway, that's it. And I have another novel, been on hold for about a year, but I was writing it, but I got involved with these other projects, and we had some illness in the family, and I got involved with that. And so anyway, I'm having everything is good. The illness has been banished, and we are. My plays are all going off to the publisher, and see what happens with them, and I can get back to the novel. See what happens with that.
This is what Suzanne can say, and I can say. I mean, Bill is a working writer who's never satisfied with the previous draft. He is revising. When he's going up to give a speech, he's still crossing out and changing right up till he gets up to the podium. So a writer who's never satisfied, who's always reaching, like you said, that language, to find that music, to find something deeper in his subconsciousness. You know, that's a working writer who's always working, reworking, and making the best iteration of a creative work. And I see that all the time. And this is no different. You know, he wasn't going to just send these off. He poured over them, polished them, reworked them. And I'm really looking forward to it. I've seen some of them perform, but some of them are new, you know, not been seen, not been published. So it's pretty exciting.
Great. Well, again, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And if there's no more questions, I think that's a wrap.
Thank you very much.
So thank you, Paul. Thank you, Mr. Kennedy, and everybody for joining us tonight.
Excellent. Good night.